Let me introduce today's discussion by mentioning some of the issues that we want to discuss. Number one, the question of the vaccine, but specifically in the case of young women. And as we go along, I'll explain why. Secondly, I'd like to discuss the following issue. Grandchildren who've been invited by their grandparents for a visit, and the son, let's say, the middle generation is worried about perhaps the children might infect their grandparents who are in a very vulnerable age bracket, etc., etc. And where does Kibbutz Av fit into this whole thing, etc., etc. And the third shiloh that we want to address is the question of masks and social distancing. To what extent are we obligated as religious Jews to follow those laws and be very careful? And during periods where there aren't so much, let's say, certain communities that are having a lull and there's very little COVID, whether or not those halachas apply, and there's a chiyuv to be careful. So these are some of the issues that I want to discuss today. And as usual, I want to open by thanking David for circulating the Mar Makomos. And we'll begin with a letter from Rabbi Berkowitz. Rabbi Berkowitz is the Rav of Sanhedria, and especially the area called Sanhedria Murchevet, not far from where we are now. He is considered the Posek Achron for many, many of the Chutzlikim who made Aliyah. He himself is originally from the States. And he was asked in general about taking the vaccine and specifically about young women, whether they should take the vaccine. And I'm more interested in the latter question. As far as the first question is concerned, he says that some people think that we have a debate as to whether or not the vaccine is dangerous. And he says that anyone who says that a vaccine is dangerous, he calls it idiotic. And what he means to say is that this is not an issue. You know, sometimes we say there are two sides of a coin, two sides of a debate, elu v'elu, but not in this case. And he says that, like any other vaccine, the experts have told us that this vaccine is not dangerous, it's effective. And although he's hesitant to paskin for anyone outside of his community, because there may be particulars in an individual case, but he says, for my own community, those who turn to me as the Rav, I will paskin that there should be a vaccine. Let me mention in passing, and I will get back to this a little bit later, that there is a video of a meeting between a very outstanding doctor named Dr. Shulman and Reb Chaim Kanevsky. And there too, Reb Chaim takes the position that we should all be vaccinated. But we'll get back to that in just a minute. What I'd like you to look at, if you have these pages, is a mimonavshach that he presents here, which I thought was very sharp. When a person asks him as to whether or not he should take the vaccine, we're not talking about young women yet, we'll get to that in a minute, So he presents a mimanavshach to them. He says, let me ask you this, are you afraid of COVID? Well, if you're afraid of COVID, you better take care of the vaccine. And if you're not afraid of COVID, and therefore he says that you're not adhering to the current health guidelines, then for sure you have to take the vaccine because you have to make sure that you don't infect anyone else. Now, as far as young women are concerned, this is what I really wanted to call your attention to, and that's the only reason I'm addressing you. You know that in the past couple of weeks, I have not discussed the question of the vaccine, but in this particular context, I think it's important. Now, young women fit into the following categories. Number one, an unmarried woman. Number two, a married woman who's not pregnant. Number three, a married woman who is pregnant. And number four, a married woman who's in the advanced stage of pregnancy. And that last category was taken up in a discussion, which you can see on video, between Dr. Schulman, who's one of the experts on fertility, on childbirth, pregnancy, and the like, and the Gaon, the great genius of our generation, Reb Chaim Kanevsky. And before we see what Rabbi Berkowitz has to say, I just want to mention that in that discussion, Dr. Schulman presented the following idea. He said that when a woman is in advanced stage of pregnancy, and she's beyond 15 weeks of pregnancy, then she definitely should be taking the vaccine. On the other hand, he said, if a woman is in early stages of pregnancy, before the first 15 months, then except for very rare Yotzim and Adofen, there should be no vaccine at that point. We do not encourage, and that's why I wanted to discuss this with you, pregnant women in the early stage of pregnancy to take the vaccine. And the discussion between Dr. Schulman and Reb Chaim did not touch on the question of a married woman who's not pregnant. That's the question that's addressed here by Rabbi Berkowitz. Now, when we talk about a married woman who's not pregnant, in a sense, and pardon the joke, but we're saying she's not yet pregnant, meaning if she's a young woman and she's married, then we can anticipate that she will become pregnant, or there is such a statistical probability. But right now, she's not pregnant. And the impression you get from the discussion between Dr. Schulman and Reb Chaim is that such a woman, if she's not pregnant, she can take the vaccine. But Rabbi Berkowitz is very hesitant. And he says the following. You'll see this, it's indented on your page, so it's very easy to follow. He says a healthy young married woman who isn't pregnant, and he adds the word yet, if she lives in my community, says Rabbi Berkowitz, then although there's a good chance that such a woman, I'm sorry, not although, but because, I should say, we assume that there's a very good chance that she won't catch the virus. And why is that? Because the premise is that she is careful and she's following all the rules and the requirements. But even if chas v'shalom she gets COVID, then chances are that this will not have any long-term medical issues. I would like to be cautious, he says, and tell this woman who's not pregnant that she should not take the vaccine. And he says, why? He says in other vaccines, there was enough time to test the grounds and see what would happen to a woman who had taken the vaccine, and then within a short period of time, she became pregnant. But in our given situation with Corona, he says, we don't have the time to roll out the vaccine and see what's going to be with a woman who gets pregnant down the line. And he says, I'd like to see babies born of women who have vaccinated before they became pregnant, but we're unable to see that. And therefore, he says that we should proceed with caution. He doesn't feel that it's an absolute no. He just feels that we haven't yet seen the results of, again, get the A plus B, a married woman who was vaccinated and then became pregnant. So he wants to avoid that situation. He's working with the premise that this young married woman will be very careful. She should take caution, and therefore she will avoid getting COVID. And even if she does get COVID, since she's healthy, he believes that she'll do fine. She will be able to fight off the virus. But he prefers that to taking the risk of her having the vaccine and then getting pregnant, because as we said, that hasn't been tested. So it seems to me that paragraph from this tshuva, so to speak, of Rav Berkowitz is the most important of it all. So now, if we take Rav Berkowitz together with what Dr. Shulman had presented to the Gaon, then we have to assume that in two categories of married women, we want to be careful about this vaccine. Category number one is a woman who is pregnant in the early stages of pregnancy, which Dr. Shulman says the first 15 months. And number two, in the case of a woman, according to Rabbi Berkowitz, who is married and has not yet gotten pregnant. I mean, well, she's not pregnant now, I should say. But there's a good chance that she will get pregnant. So here, when I put these two together, I felt it was compelling that we should discuss this. And we should pass this on perhaps to others. Now, everybody is obviously required and invited to do more research on this topic. But the material that I'm sharing with you is very, very recent. And it really touches on, the outskirts of the vaccine issue, meaning the inner, circle, the kishkis, the main thrust of the vaccine is that whenever you get the opportunity, you should take the vaccine. Don't give up on that invitation once it's given to you. And that's the main thing that we can discuss. And according to both Reb Chaim on the one side and Rabbi Berkowitz on the other, and you could quote many, many other poskim, there is no danger involved. It can only help. And they quote, I don't know if you've heard of Dr. Teitz, Dr. Akiva Tatz from South Africa, who's a great Torah scholar and at the same time a great physician. And he says that even if there is some element, they're reporting some cases of people who took the vaccine and died, and they don't know, maybe it has something to do with the vaccine, or maybe it was purely coincidental. But even so, with every medical procedure, and certainly with every vaccine in history, he gives examples from polio, there always is a fraction of a danger, but the benefits outweigh the dangers. And therefore, we have to go ahead with this vaccine. That's what we have. But I wanted to call to your attention the issue of a married woman, young in age, who is either pregnant or might become pregnant. And here there should be proceed with caution as far as the vaccine is concerned. Now, I sent you a tshuva here from Yosef Rimon. Yeah, please.
Does he give any time frame with regards to this? In other words, any woman who is young and of that age would he say within a 6 months, whatever? How does he define that time period?
He just says a young married woman who is not pregnant but could become pregnant at any moment. We don't know. We're not prophets, but I don't know statistically what the chances are. I don't know if he would make a distinction if she was on contraception. Maybe the din would change. But he's saying the din for his women in his community, because he knows that the married women in his community are very careful. And there's no great fear that they will come down with COVID. And even if they would, they have the strength and the stamina to fight it off. And therefore, he'd rather them postpone the vaccine because, as I said, we've never seen the results of a woman who took the vaccine and then got pregnant. What happened in that case?
So, I'm sorry, he's, with regards to any younger person, he's not giving that same kind of caution.
No, absolutely not. In fact, there is a reference at the bottom, if you have the page, to the latest research, and they're talking about, dispelling the old idea. When I say old, I mean to say the early stages of COVID, that only older people are at great risk and not young men or young people in general. And he says that the latest research, you can, just press on the link and you'll read the latest research that especially young men, for whatever reason, I'm not going into detail, they are, they could suffer tremendously from COVID. And therefore they should be vaccinated. Okay, let's go on now to this, what I call a very fascinating question that Rav Yosef Tzvi Rimon, he's one of the great leaders of the Mizrahi here in this part of the world, addresses the question of grandchildren who are requested or summoned by their grandparents to visit during this period of the pandemic. It seems to me, before we get into the tshuva itself, which you have hopefully in front of you, that there are two ways of approaching this issue. One way is to analyze this issue from the perspective of what I call gram nezek. A person, according to Jewish law, and that's the underlying principle of everything that we're doing today, is enjoined from putting anyone else into danger. I can't put a stumbling block in front of a blind person. And even if my grandparents think that, they're immune or whatever it is, or they can, we're all in the same family, that's an attitude. But nevertheless, as a grandchild and as a Jew and as any human being, I have to be super careful that I don't infect anyone, and certainly not someone who might be in that danger range of an older person. And in that context, this shaila should be analyzed not from the perspective of kibud av va'em, but from the perspective of gram nezek. So that even if you are summoning me to come, I might have to refuse because I realize that there might be a possibility that I could infect you. And the answer to that question might be much simpler than what we have here in front of us, which is a totally different approach to the shaila. And that is take, a medical perspective, go into detail about the various nuances. Are the grandparents in a high danger range? Are they healthy? Do they have medical history? What age exactly are they? How strong are they? Are they perhaps have antibodies they've already tested? Maybe they've already had corona and they've recovered. A host of a million questions that you could ask about the grandparents. And then ask yourself the question about the children, the grandchildren. Perhaps they should be tested. Then ask yourself the following question. What about grandchildren coming to visit grandparents and maintaining distance and taking all the precautions that are absolutely necessary? So, for example, when you have to go to a supermarket and you're exposed to other people, you take precautions. You wear a mask, you distance yourself. In the case of grandchildren, that's a little bit more challenging. You want to hug your grandparents. But nevertheless, that's one perspective. Rav Rimon takes an entirely different perspective. And I'm going to present to you his view, but I'm going to afterwards want to reformulate it in my own logical terms. He starts by quoting a Rambam. And the Rambam says that a person who exposes himself to danger, and he says, I don't care, it's my life. Ich bin balabas auf sich allein. I'm the owner of my own body, my own life. The Rambam says that such a person gets makas mardus. We give him lashes. And what the Rambam is trying to emphasize is that you're not allowed to put yourself into a dangerous situation. And if grandparents inviting grandchildren means that they're exposing themselves to danger, then they're not allowed to do so. The halacha doesn't sanction a person exposing himself to danger. You're not the owner of your own life. However, it seems, and Rav Moshe Feinstein wrote a long, extensive tshuva on this, but it's really based on the Noda B'Yehuda came before Rav Moshe, that there are situations in which we do expose ourselves to danger, and the halacha permits it. And for the sake of parnasa, there are certain occupations that are a bit more dangerous than other occupations. And if it's reasonable and people take those jobs, and it's common for people, for the sake of parnasa, to enter into that danger, then Rav Moshe permits it. And the Noda B'Yehuda 2.5 centuries earlier. So that there are situations in which the halacha is more flexible about exposing oneself to danger for a greater good. Now, what is that greater good? In the case of parnasa, what does it mean? Does it mean that I only have $1 million in the bank and I want $2 million in the bank? That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about basic sustenance, or a little bit more, let's call it middle class, but I want to be able to support my family with honor, in comfort, to make sure that I can provide what they need. And for that good, for that sake, a certain element of danger is permissible. And there are many, many occupations that involve exposing oneself to danger. What relevance does that have to us? We're not talking about grandparents who need a parnasa, and therefore they can expose themselves to the danger of having their grandchildren visit. And here Rav Rimon makes what I call a leap of faith. He wants to set up the following analogy. That just like for parnasa, which is more what we call physical sustenance, material sustenance, we're going to allow and be flexible about danger, exposure. So too in a psychological world of danger. There are dangers that are psychological in nature. And he feels that one profound example of psychological danger is grandparents and how much more so if it's just one grandparent, who are in a state of quarantine. You won't see them neither in the supermarket, you won't even see them in synagogues. They are quarantined, in many cases self-quarantined, because they are overly concerned and rightfully concerned about this disease. He says, and you'll see it on the bottom of his first page, that avoiding danger can sometimes itself be a danger. Like, for example, in the case of Parnasa. But here also, he suggests that if we want to avoid danger, then this itself might be a danger. And he writes that loneliness for an older person is a grave danger. We're all social animals. We need company. How much more so in the case of elderly people who are alone and they want to spend some time with their own grandchildren. He says, this situation, if you prevent the grandchildren from visiting the grandparents, he claims that that exposes the grandparents to a danger which is at least comparable to the danger of someone who needs parnasa. And psychological danger is no less dangerous than physical danger. Now, at this point, I would like to add a little bit of my own 2 cents here, if you'll allow me. And I would say the following. First, as we said before, Rav Rimon has a totally different perspective on the Shaila than the one we presented. We thought the issue was whether children are allowed to, in a sense, expose their grandparents to danger. And then we wanted to analyze, is this danger and can they guarantee, social distancing and the like? Rav Rimon is looking at it from a totally different perspective. He wants to analyze the Shaila from the perspective of the need on a psychological level of the grandparents to expose themselves to danger, because if they don't, they are exposing themselves to danger because of the loneliness and the repercussions on a psychological level. I would like to add the following. The Shaila, if you read, was asked by the children, not the grandchildren. And I'll just read it to you. We have elderly parents, and they want that we come with our grandchildren to visit them. We are concerned due to the outbreak of a second wave of COVID, but they would rather have more time with their grandchildren than have a longer life. I thought that perhaps we could take a slightly different approach to the Shaila within the perspective of this tshuva, that the issue is kibbud av va'em and the limits of kibbud av va'em. So if my parents ask me to bring my grandchildren, then I have a mitzvah of kibbud av. However, the halacha says that kibbud av has its limits. For example, if the father commands his son to violate the Shabbos, there's no kibbud av. And the language of the Gemara in Kiddushin, in the Sugya Kibbud Av, is Atov avicha mitzuvim b'kvod shamayim. That you and your father are both obligated and committed to a greater sovereign ruler. In other words, I view my father as a sovereignty. He has the right to make demands on me, but he himself, as a father, as a Jew, is bound by the sovereignty of God. There's a higher ruler. And if the father violates that higher rule, then there's no kibbud av. And since the Gemara says that v'shamartem yodis nafshosechem, we are not allowed to expose ourselves to danger, therefore, the tzivui of the father to his son, bring me my grandchildren. You know, you're imagining Yaakov asking for Ephraim and Menashe. That tzivui itself doesn't register on the Richter scale of kibbud av ha'em, because the grandparents are not working with the right thoughts. They are in effect violating the Torah law by exposing themselves to danger. Hence, there's no mitzvah of kibbud av. Now I would read the tshuva of Rav Rimon and put it in a different perspective. Is there a halachic permission for the grandparents to demand that they see their grandchildren? Are they violating the law of Ushmartem? And the answer is, because of this balance between psychological loneliness on the one hand and the exposure to COVID on the other, we're talking about a danger which outweighs another danger. So we're not talking about jumping into a situation where you're safe and now you're exposed to danger. You're already in the danger, and therefore kibbud av will apply. That's what I thought would be a nice way of presenting this shaila. But now Rav Rimon throws in another, as I would call it, a curveball. What do grandparents do during COVID? Do they invite their grandchildren or do they not? Now, I don't know exactly how you would take a census. I can only talk about my family, and maybe I shouldn't say this publicly, but yeah, we see our grandchildren. And now he accesses and applies the principle of a Gemara in Masechta Yevamis and Iksubis called Shomer P'sayim Hashem. That when we define danger, we look at the way people behave. So you may say that statistically it's very dangerous to drive a car, especially in these parts, but people drive cars. And therefore, Shomer P'sayim Hashem. See, he says...
Just to be clear, you see your grandchildren with social distancing?
I plead the fifth on that. That's an American phrase.
Okay.
Do the Canadians have a Fifth Amendment or something similar?
Not.
I don't know. Do you have a constitution?
We only have taxes. We only have taxes.
Wait a minute, Joe. You have taxes, but you also have days off. I never know when it's going to be Canada Day. You know what I'm saying? But what I wanted to point out is that Israel has no constitution. So there's no Fifth Amendment. I don't know about Canada. Does Canada have a constitution?
We have a constitution.
Oh, you do have a constitution. So maybe there's something like a Fifth Amendment where you could plead, I don't want to answer your question. But maybe from the fact that I'm quoting the Fifth Amendment, you can understand the answer to your question. In this case. In any event, he writes here beautifully. He says, if everyone acts in a certain manner, then that reality is not considered dangerous. And he says if normal people expose themselves, like driving a car, he doesn't give that example, then it becomes part of the natural way to live, and Shomer P'sayim Hashem, Hashem protects us. And he says that you will find, again, he's talking about the Israeli authorities, the public health authorities, that they have established certain leniencies that people have accepted. Now, I don't know the specifics here. He doesn't quote the law about grandchildren visiting grandparents. But I think that even during the lockdown, again, don't quote me on this, I don't know if this is accurate or not, but if my impression is that if you get stopped by the police, and the policeman will ask you where you're going, there's a lockdown, and you tell them you're going to bring food, for example, to your grandparents, they let you go without blinking. Okay, I don't know if he's telling you have to bring a package of food, which might not be a bad idea, but your visit to your grandparents is no less important than bringing them food. So it probably would be a leniency and not a violation of the public authorities. But in any event, as far as pure halacha is concerned, in terms of working within the conceptual framework of halacha, we have something called shomer psoyim Hashem. He says, practically speaking, grandparents are keen for these visits, and if the law allows it, again, you have to observe all the, he's not willing to say, hug and kiss, but if you observe the distancing and the required rules and so forth and so on, then he says, then not only are you allowed, but it's even a mitzvah. So the thing that surprised me about this tshuva, two things. Number one, that he didn't approach it from the perspective of the grandchildren, whether or not they have a problem of gram hezek. That's why I thought the child should begin. And secondly, I don't know why he doesn't quote the halacha that there's no kibbud av if your father commands you to violate the Torah. Now, our third topic for today, which brings us back to the Big Day Chamudos, is the question of social distancing. Are we required, according to halacha, we're not dealing again, as I mentioned last week, with Dina de Malchusa Dina. There are various leniencies that maybe we can circumvent as far as the public health authorities are concerned, but purely in halachic terms, are we required, A, to distance, he calls it Dalet Amos, stay Dalet Amos away from the next person, and B, wearing a mask? Are these halachic requirements? Now, keep in mind that Corona in these parts of the world, and I think also in the States, I don't know about Canada, it's been up, down, and then back up again. So when the first wave of Corona was disastrous, and then there was a lull. And if you know the history here in Israel, they were very proud, the numbers, the statistics were incredible. And that was it, because then it went all the way up. And now we're facing a situation here which is worse than the first wave. Something similar, I think, went on in America. This Shaila, as you see on page 117, which is the first page of the Shaila, Simon Tzamach, in the Big Day Chamudos, is a question that was raised and addressed to Rabbi Kleinman by a Rosh Yeshiva in Lakewood Yeshiva. And you get the impression that the tshuva was written during the lull period, before it started swinging up again. And I think that we can make almost a kal v'chomer. Again, I don't want to let the cat out of the bag, but at the end of it all, he's going to say that we have to go through the sugya in Bava Kama, and we're going to come to the conclusion that even during, that's my view, that even during this lull period, we still have not yet defeated COVID. And he has a whole section in his tshuva, which is fascinating, about what it means to declare an emergency and then declare the termination of that emergency. And he says that once we get into a sakana situation, it may be a lot more difficult, al pi halacha, to establish that that sakana has completely terminated than a situation where we don't know yet whether there is a sakana. Once there is sakana, it's much more difficult, much more challenging. So he writes, Ha'im adayin, do we still have a chiyuv lishmar merchak shel dalet amos michavero? And do we still have a chiyuv to wear masks? And Baruch Hashem, the first part of this tshuva, we can really breeze through because we put in a lot of work in the previous tshuva, Nomen and Tes, in which he starts with the Gemara Bava Kama. The Gemara says, Dever Ba'ir, Kanes Raglcha, when the Dever is out there, it's an infectious disease, then quarantine yourself in your house. And the Maril, you remember this, beautiful Chazorah for us, who is supported by the Marshal and codified in the Shulchan Aruch. The Maril says from 6 centuries ago and more that although the Gemara says Kanes Raglcha, that's only after Huchzak Dever Ba'ir. That's in the second stage. In the early stage, when the disease is just beginning to spread, then on the contrary, just like the Brisa quoted in the same Sugya Bava Kama says, in the case of a famine, pick up your legs and run. The same thing applies to Dever in its initial stages. But in its later stage, after it's Chazik Ba'ir, then Kadesh Raglcha, you should not be trouncing around trying to flee and find another location. On the other hand, the base David says on the contrary, that even if this Chazek Dever Ba'ir, since in any way you might have to go out, if you're in the city and by going out you're going to expose yourself to the danger, then Kanes Raglcha, that's what the Gemara has in mind. But if on the other hand you're going to anyway expose yourself because you need supplies and so forth, then once you're going out into the city and you're no longer quarantined, then Pazer Raglcha, go ahead and find yourself a safer place. And the Beis David, therefore, rejects any distinction between the beginning of the disease, that's before Nischazek, and the end of the disease when it's very powerful. And it's not just the Beis David. The Maharsha seems to indicate that that's the case. The Zera Emes accepts the Beis David. So he's not alone over here. And basically, according to the Beis David, we're not going to say that once the Dever is Nischazik B'ir, then Kanes Raglcha. What we're going to say is that if you're in the city, and if you leave your house, that will mean exposing yourself to danger, then Kanes Raglcha. And that's the Brisa in Masechta Sanhedrin. But if, on the other hand, it's a safer bet for you to run, flee, and find a different location, that's what you have to do, because of Unushmarta Miotis Nafshel Seich. Now, the question that we wanted to ask, and that's in the last paragraph on page 117, is that the Gemara there quotes a brisa that Dever Be'ir al Yahalech Odom Be'emtza Derech. In other words, we would have thought that if you go down the middle path, then you're safe. And the Brisa wants to tell us no, that even in the middle of the road, you're not, exposed to too many people. You are at a distance from people on the right side and on the left side, you're going in the middle. There still is a danger. And he writes that according to the Beis David and the Maharsha, that school of thought, it came to the point where he feels he has to flee from the city, even though it's Nischazek Dever Ba'ir, or another case where he's forced to go out to the shuk in the city. In all these cases, he has to be careful even in the middle of the road because of the Malach HaMavis that goes in the middle of the road. Now, if you turn to page 118, he says, in the middle of the first paragraph, the long paragraph, Vehine, he writes that the reason why initially, before Ischazik, B'tchila, the Shulchan Aruch, based on the Maril Paskins, that you should run away, or in the case of the Beis David and the Marsha, even after the Ischazek Dever, when the Dever is very heavy, in those cases, the exposure to the shuk, if he stays locally, is dangerous. And he shouldn't be allowed to go out into the shuk at all. Hazer Raglacha, I'm sorry, Kanes Raglacha. He says, Sarach Lomar, Dilazeh Gufa, Ba B'Gemar V'Hizit Shelo Yelech B'Emtza Derech, Ratza Lomar, D'Sheyotze B'Ofen Shenizar Me'Sakana, Dainu She'eno Holich B'Emtza Derech, Ela B'Tzidei Rishus HaRabban. He says that according to the Shulchan Aruch, based on the Maril, that you're not supposed to go out into the streets once the Dever is Nischazik Ba'ir, then when the Gemara advocates that you should avoid the middle of the road, what the Gemara means is that that's where most people are going. You should find yourself a corner to the right or to the left of Rishus HaRabban where there are very few people walking. And that means that what the Gemara is saying is that if you're exposed to a dangerous situation, because it's Nischazek Dever Be'ir, then you need social distancing. And this becomes a halachic requirement to distance yourself from people and find yourself privacy. So that if it's Nischazek Dever Be'ir, your first choice, if possible, would be to quarantine yourself according to the Shulchan Aruch. Lock yourself up in your house. But if you have to go out into the shuk, then avoid the public areas. So it's not the way we want to interpret the Gemara, that by going down the middle of the road, you will avoid people, but on the contrary, that's where the masses of people walk. And therefore, you should find yourself in Sidei Rishus HaRabban. And that is social distancing. And therefore, in the paragraph on the left column, he says, when, at what point is it considered Nischazek Dever Ba'ir? This is a definition that's very ambiguous. You're going to tell me that it's a sakana to go out, and only if need be, absolutely, I have no choice, I have to go out, and then I have to avoid the public because it's Nischazek Dever Ba'ir. What is Nischazek Dever Ba'ir? What the Gemara says that Nischazek Dever Ba'ir means that 3 people died of Dever on 3 consecutive days. Says the Ritva, that might be applicable to Dever, but as far as other kinds of diseases like Askara and Charchor, which are different types of diseases that are very infectious, they affect the throat and very dangerous, he says, we don't care whether it's 3 days consecutive. However, if 3 people have died from that disease, that makes it into a Nischazek Ba'ir. That generates a sakana. And at that point, we should be announcing a public fast day. And at that point, we should avoid showing up in public places. 3 people have died from this disease. And this is the Ritva. The Beis Yosef in Simon Tov Kuf Ayin Hey quotes the Yerushalmi, which is discussing Askara, which is a highly dangerous disease. It's a deadly disease. Afilu lo meis mimenu rak echad. 1 person died. We're going to announce a tainis tzibur. And the Beis Yosef himself, after quoting this Yerushalmi, says, "Mikol makom nireh dedafka kishayorad choli zela harbe anoshim." He says that it doesn't matter whether 1 person died of Askara or many people took sick with Askara. The afal pishalo meis adayin, even though people haven't died yet, we have to announce a public fasting, meaning that this is enough of a sakana because a number of people have contracted this disease. And moving on to page 119, and again, the reason I'm moving very fast is because we've really seen a lot of this material in the past. He says that there's one shita in the poskim that the only time we're going to determine that we need a public fast day because it's a real sakana is when it's affected many different neighborhoods in the city. If Rov Shchunos Ha'ir have reported this infectious disease, and it's a deadly disease, people have died, or one person died, then we declare a public fasting. It's already considered a sakana. And on the bottom right of page 119, he writes, Achar shehuchzak efshad lo choshiv sha'ovra atzara ad shetisbata legamre. He says that if we're in a situation of tzara, of sakana, we've declared a fast day, there's an infectious disease, it's going around, somebody has already died. According to some, we have representation of most of the neighborhoods in the city from that disease. At what point can we determine that there is no longer a sakana? And he suggests, and this is the Big Day Chamudos, that it's very possible that the sakana lo avra ad shetisbata legamre. Do you hear this, Rabosa? This has tremendous halachic repercussions. He's saying that if you're trying to set up a sakana situation, you're trying to determine, is there a sakana that just came into being, was generated, then you can talk about somebody dying, talk about Rov Shchunos Ba'ir and all that stuff until you finally decide and determine this is a sakana. But once you've already determined that you're in a tzara, a sakana situation, and now you want to determine that that sakana is no longer, then he says you need bittul legamre, that the entire city is completely clean and finished with this infectious disease. And he wraps it up here on page 119. Ume'ata novo l'nidan didan. He says, now let's put this all into perspective in a practical sense regarding corona. He says, for sure, that was an infectious disease. And he says, whether you go like the Mechaber or like other poskim, he says, for sure, once this choli of COVID has spread throughout the city, that's called a choli malechus, an infectious disease. And even according to that tshuva that I mentioned earlier, he identifies that the Divrei Malkiel, that with regard to other cholim, we need rov kitvei ha'ir, meaning most of the neighborhoods in the city. He says, benidon didan, in our case of corona, nispashta corona berov kitvei ha'ir. Ubechai gavna bevadai hachiyuv lizoyer. He says, we definitely have a halachic obligation to be careful. And it's like that Gemara that we saw above a Kama, that he should not walk in the middle of the street. He should be exercising caution and social distancing. He should go to the Tzidei Rishus Harabim. V'izhiru hamumchim shelo likanes b'daled amos shel chavero. He says, Ki be'emes heicha doleka hechrech, hachiyuv hu lichnos raglov, kamo lishmar kidei lishmar misakana. He says that, in truth, if he doesn't have to go out of his house, then he's obligated to stay within his house, because this is already nischazek dever ba'ir knots raglacha. And gam kishiyotze, if he has to go out of his house for whatever pressing reason, tzarich lios biofen shenishmar misakana v'hu chiyuv mitad adin. This is not a question of making my own individual decision based on what I feel is acceptable. However, he's going to have to fulfill all the requirements of the health authorities in order to take caution, If he has to go out, again, according to strict halacha, in an ideal sense, he shouldn't even go out of his house. But yesh l'stapek, here's where it becomes the gray area, ambiguous. It's no longer spreading, which, by the way, might mean what they call herd immunity. You know, everyone already had it already. I know somebody said to me, I don't know if he's being facetious, that in Lakewood, everyone here, everybody already had COVID. I don't know. I can certainly tell you about what goes on in certain neighborhoods in Yerushalayim and also in New York. Everyone had it already in one form or another. He says, at what point do we consider it batla sakana, that it's no longer danger, and now we can lower our guards? And Rabbos, I have to tell you that this is the issue now on the table, especially here in Israel, where I don't know how many people, I think it's already up to 1.5 million people have had already 2 inoculations. So at what point do we finally say we can lower our guard? But unfortunately, despite all the inoculations, we still have plenty of people, unfortunately, and it's very tragic, who are getting sick with corona. He says, L'chora ein was a geder borur. I don't know of a clear-cut we don't have a clear-cut determination and definition in halacha in legal terms. When do we say but la sakana? Because he believes that in order to apply the principle of but la sakana, you need but lo legamre. You have to completely get rid of the danger. It's no longer dangerous at all, period. He says, and this is on the last page of the Tshuva, that's page 120, Af mishin is barer be'emishin is batla choli be'ir, adayin yesh la'ayin, al pi ma shekosav hagon achsam sofer dehecha she'ein malchius skuros v'yotzenu boen. He says that the Chasam Sofer already 150 years ago, I don't know if I'm exaggerating, already he was dealing with a situation of open cities. It's not like back in the time of the Chazal and certainly the Talmud and so forth, or even in more modern periods of time where there were closed cities. You know, if somebody showed up from another city, it was rare. We have open borders here. People are coming in and out of the cities, right? He says, he calls it shayoros mitzuyos. You know, that's a phrase from the Gemara in Gittin, that there are caravans going back and forth. He says, in that case, the fact that at this moment in time, there are no cases of the disease locally in the city, that's not enough to say batla sakana. But again, I would add a footnote here, because this was written 2 or 3 months ago, when they were still allowing some level of travel, you know, for international travel. Today, you know, my wife is now in America taking care of her mother. I don't know if she's going to get a plane back because of the new restrictions. In any event, I'm just trying to tell you that there are many countries now that are absolutely skuros. And therefore, in those countries, if they're totally hermetically sealed, it could be that you can come to a determination that batla sakana. The Niralanias Daiti, he says, this is the last paragraph of the tshuva, the kol zeh shayach rak lemisha daim lo chole ba'oso chole. He says to require a person to social distance and say that al pi din he's chayav to wear a mask. He believes that the exception to this rule is someone who recovered from corona. And he quotes the Marshal, again, you're going back 5 centuries ago. And the Marshal writes that Mishik far chola biotso choli v'nisrape su eino chayav livra. He says that the Marshal already set up 2 categories: someone who never had corona, again, he's not talking about corona, as opposed to someone who already had it, he says that if you have an option of running away and you've never had the disease, that's what you have to do. But that doesn't apply to someone who recovered from the disease. So at this point, Rav Daniel asks the following question here at the end of this tshuva. Someone who recovered from corona. Again, let's say, again, there's so much confusion about COVID, it's unbelievable. So even what I'm about to say, which sounds poshut, is not at all poshut. But let's say he has antibodies. He took a serology test. He passed with flying colors. So you would say this is a perfect example of applying the rule of the Marshal, and he doesn't have to run away. For him, it's not a sakana. He says no. Poshut, shekevan shenimtza bein b'nei adam hanizharin umefachadim milio smuchim la'adadi. He is a recovery case, but he finds himself in the company of those who are super duper careful. They are worried about contracting the disease, and therefore they are so cautious that they don't go near each other. Meaning a mask. Why? Why do I, meaning I, a recovery case, why do I have to wear a mask? Why do I have to do social distancing? I just came from Mincha now, right? So the closest guy to me was at the other end of this long table. But why? I'm a recovery case. Again, as I said before, maybe a serology test would be relevant. But now my son is a doctor. He tells me that it's so confusing. There are people who have high serology and we're not sure because there are all sorts of mutations out there, different forms of the disease. No one is guaranteed. He says the opposite. Even in cases where they score very low on the serology, they have what's called T cells. Have you heard about this, Maisa? T cells, that as soon as they get exposed to the disease, those cells that have a dormant resistance and antibodies all of a sudden show their thing and they send out antibodies. So you don't see it in the blood at this point. That's the good news. But the bad news is that even if you score high in antibodies, that doesn't mean you're guaranteed protection. But he says, Rav Daniel, something totally different. Another angle, another perspective. He says, Shalolahavis es habrios. Do you remember, Rabosai, that we discussed last week the issue of bi'isusa, that if there's nervous tension and extreme worry, I call it freaked out. I mean, I'm probably dating myself with my idiomatic expressions. It's probably something more modern than freaked out. But anyway, you get the point, I hope. Then that itself is a cause of terrible illness. And he says, if you're amongst people who are so cautious and they oblige all the rules of the health authorities and they're wearing masks and they're doing social distancing and you show up without a mask and you jump into the middle of this whole dance over here, then he says you're being mavis because they don't know. You're not wearing a sign. And today even the sign wouldn't mean much because we simply don't have a handle on this disease. And therefore he says that he asked Reb Shmuel Kamenetsky, his Rebbe, like he did last week. I mean, last week meaning the tshuva we did last week. And he says that Reb Shmuel said the following: Afilu heicha shemitzad adin leka sakanta. This person is not in danger. But yodea shebnei adam makpidim al shmiras merchak o levishas masveh. He knows that the people around him are very careful. He's not in a sakana. Sarich lino kamosam. He has to do exactly what they do, shalola havis, so as not to create fear amongst them. They're going to freak out. Here's this guy who's not wearing a mask. But he says if there's no corona in the city, then ein chiyuv lizoyer mitzad adin, afsha choli adayin motzui b'yayoros acheros, so that Rav Shmuel is not worried about the shayoros mitzuyos going from one city to the other. If here in Lakewood, for example, we have no corona patients, then the sakana is over Shalom al Yisrael. But again, as I emphasize, in the Big Day Chamudos, he's worried, based on a tshuva of the Chassam Sofer, of Shayoros Mitzuyos, people coming from the outside. But those who are Mekil apparently are somewhere. Now, if we have a resurgence, then we're in trouble, because the resurgence sometimes is worse than the first round. So just to summarize, we have come to the conclusion from this tshuva that the requirements of both social distancing and wearing masks are rooted and are anchored in the halacha, clearly in the halacha, a chiyuv mitzad adin, especially when we get to the point of ischazek dever ba'ir, because at that point, he's not allowed to go out of his house. Kanes raglecha. He should be quarantining himself. And if an event he has to go out, then he shouldn't walk in the middle of the streets where the people are going. He should find himself a corner where he's isolated so that he's doing social distancing. At what point do we finally say that sakana is gone? We know exactly when the sakana begins. And we know that even if one person in the city died, the Ritva says that's already enough to generate a sakana, and we have to enact a kind of tzibur. But when does the sakana dissipate? That's not clear in Allah. And there are two tzadim, there are two possible approaches to that question. One approach is very extreme. It says we need a bittul legamre. We have to get rid of this disease completely. No cases of people coming down with this infection. Otherwise, we're still continuing those chiyuvim of the sakana. The other approach says no. Right now, our city has survived. We've recovered from the disease, and therefore, it's no longer a sakana. Any questions so far? Oh, so far, I just realized what time it is. Okay. So we're up to Siman Samach Aleph. I think you got a copy of it, right, David? And that's the question of, which would, again, we touched on in the past, but we never did it really head on. Do we trust the doctors? When they say that this person is in danger, can we violate the Shabbos? There are other physicians who poo-poo it. They say it's not in danger. How do we balance this out? And is it only 2 against 2? What if it's 2 against 1? There's only one doctor that says it's sakana. Do we violate the Shabbos? But there are many different dimensions of that tshuva, and Bali Neder will try to analyze that. So the one thing that I'd like you to pass on, I don't know, have they started inoculating in Canada, or it's still only like...
Not really.
It's not yet hit the masses?
Barely.
So you're at the beginning stages. So what I'm asking is that you spread the word that there may be room for caution with regard to young married women, and especially women who are pregnant. Just pass that on. Again, you may have heard about it, but maybe you didn't hear about it because it's not so relevant. You haven't started vaccinating in Canada yet on a massive level. But here, it's very, very relevant. Okay, then?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Good. Thank you. Have a great week and a great Shabbos Parshas B'Shalom.
Wow.